I'm Andy Agathangelo, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. We are a certified social enterprise. We have a formal mission, which is to promote ongoing reform of the financial sector so that it serves society better. We have approximately 6,000 people around the world who receive our comms, our weekly newsletter called the Transparency Task Force. We're interested in many, many, many topics. And of course, at the heart of our interest is the overall idea that the financial sector ought to behave in a transparent, truthful, and trustworthy way. And therefore, the topic of tonight's session, all about integrity and trust and ethics in the financial industry, is of great interest to us. Really pleased that Dr. Kara Tambala is with us. I'll speak more about Kara after we've completed a short round of introductions. And I'm going to go to Nigel Cairns first. Nigel, could you just very, very briefly tell us a little bit about yourself and why the topic of ethics in financial services is of interest to you? Thank you, Nigel.
Hi, everybody, and Andy, good evening. I'm an ongoing victim of bank malfeasance misbehaviour since 2008 and still occupied on a daily basis fighting the extremely difficult position that I was put in by my bank, which has caused not only financial hardship but considerable knock-on damage to the whole of my family. And because of my involvement with TTF, I've become more and more aware of the broad scope that financial misbehaviour has caused to so many people's lives in this country. And the basic problem is because of the ethical issues that, or absence of ethical values that are applied by the companies that are causing the damage. So, you know, we're getting to the root cause and the basic causes of human behaviour that lie at the foundation of the problem, which I think is the only place to start. Okay.
Thank you, Nigel. You've really helped set the scene very, very well with your own situation there. Nigel's in Devon, in southwest England, for those of you that may not know. We're going to go across the Atlantic to Mr. Eric Smith. So Eric, please introduce yourself, and after Eric, we'll get to Richard Loxton. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I am a former practicing attorney that shifted out of, I think I might have lost it. Okay, I hit the wrong button here. Former practicing attorney in estate planning, corporate business transactions before deciding to enter into the financial service marketplace. I am Dr. Kara. Have been an institutional consultant, you know, in the U.S. SEC registered investment advisory world. Interestingly, on the point of ethics, obviously we have an ethical code as attorneys, but in every formal filing that an RIA does, you know, we have to have an ethics code in the industry, and virtually every investment advisory firm and brokerage firm in the U.S. has a code of ethics, and yet there are still, you know, damages occurring and wrongdoing occurring all over the place, as can be seen from violation tracker and all of this. And it goes back to the point of transparency. Anything can happen in the dark. What the firms say publicly is not, in fact, what you too often find in practice. So the whole idea of transparency and its relation to ethics is that I think it gives the investing public, as well as the well-intentioned members of the industry themselves who want to do best for their clients, a better way to do it. We've developed some technology to open the curtain, make the process fully transparent, and empower people, including investment advisors and individual investors, to do a better job of self-protection, something we could discuss later. But Andy, I hope that helps a little.
It does. Thank you very much indeed, Eric. Thank you. And folks, please do feel free to put your contact details or anything else you want to in the chat. We'll circulate the chat so everybody will have a record of it afterwards. And I'm sure some of you will make very good contacts with new people tonight. So thank you, Eric. Next, we're going to go to Richard, and after Richard, we're going to go to Thomas. So Richard Loxton, please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Right, okay. So as I said, my name is Richard Loxton. I'm also based in the Southwest near Bath. My background is that I was a victim of fraud, and there's no doubt I was a victim of fraud. It's well documented. When I applied to the Financial Ombudsman Service, it was in relation to a third-party claim on buildings insurance. They made matters worse. And the thing about, yep, lots of people, lots of organizations have all sorts of marvelous codes of practice and whatever. But unfortunately, I know from very bitter experience and dating back to many, many years ago when I was in the army, that if people in a position of authority, if they think they will get away with it, they will tell the most outrageous lies. And so it's a matter of not being able, not just having these codes of conduct, but making sure people are accountable. And Andy and I had conversations about this before. So slight digression, but yes, the directors of the Financial Conduct Authority probably are almost immune to any prosecution because they're so far removed from the actual frontline action. But there are people within the Financial Conduct Authority, the Financial Ombudsman Service, and the BBRS and various other people who are vulnerable, but that's another issue. And certainly from the last speaker was saying, yes, there is definitely scope for relatively simple software to be able to identify where actual bad practice has practiced. I'm working on that at the moment, but it's still work in progress.
Richard, thank you very much indeed. And Cara, one of the points that I think should come out in our conversation tonight, I say tonight, it's evening, of course, you're in the UK, it's just gone lunchtime where you are, Cara, as you know, is that not only is there good reason to have questions about the conduct of the financial sector itself, the industry, the market participants, the companies, but there are also a growing number of questions about the, let me be blunt, the integrity and the ethics of the regulatory framework that surrounds it. We're becoming increasingly concerned, Cara, with conflicts of interest, the revolving door problem, regulatory capture, three things that we think are very closely interconnected and help explain why the performance of the institutions there to protect consumers from harm seem to so frequently be failing us here in the UK and arguably in other parts of the world as well. Thank you, Richard. We'll go to Thomas next, and then we'll go to Christoph. Mr. Thomas Walford, thank you.
Thank you, Andy. My name's Thomas Walford of Expert Evidence International. We act as expert witnesses in the courts, explaining the precedents and concepts that apply in both criminal and civil litigation, in banking, investment, and regulatory matters. As expert witnesses, we are charged with presenting our opinions in a clear, unbiased, impartial, and independent way. Many of the cases involve both moral and ethical judgments. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. And Thomas has been particularly helpful in relation to a number of areas where his real expertise is coming in remarkably handy. Christoph, I'm always so pleased to see you at our events for many reasons, and you know what I'm about to say. I just enjoy saying your name so much. Mr. Christoph Grabowski.
Yes,
please have you with us.
Christoph, this is international pronunciation. The Polish pronunciation is Krzysztof Grabowski. I am a former securities broker, Then I made a PhD in law, in company law, especially with listed companies law, especially with shareholders' rights directive. So my passion and personal passion is corporate governance, business ethics. Currently, I am already retired, but still active as opinion maker and expert witness for the cars. Just today, I've been to the court in a case when one person earns some money using the money of other persons. I am a little bit late for joining that seminar because I've been just finishing my comment on the LinkedIn discussion about the decision of the European Tribunal of Justice, which is just in work phase. About the credits in Swiss francs. The expectation is that the tribunal will judge that banks cannot charge clients with no money, with any money for using the capital from those credits. Polish supervision authority has the other, the opposite opinion, arguing that it can that if there is such decision of European Tribunal, the bank will lose a lot of money, so that the Polish the Poland might lose a lot of money. But my comment was that, in my opinion, that decision would be a good balance of great inequality between banks as professionals on the market and users simply users of those credits because banks has full, or at least should have full knowledge of all the consequences of such agreements, such credit agreements, and about the risk of those agreements. But consumers should, at least in theory, have full trust to banks, that the banks will not use that inequality for the bank's interest only, neglecting the interest of consumers. Well, so it may be, it may have serious consequences for the budget of the country, but it would be for a sign of real justice. Well,
Christoph, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go to Louise Stevenson. Louise, if you're happy to introduce yourself, I'll then introduce Tae Kwai for Louise, to you first of all. Thank you.
Hi there, everyone. I have a very long history, like one other person that mentioned 2008 there. Situation started. I likewise started in 2008. I worked for a major police authority in charge of the evidence, and I made a protected disclosure at my place of work, which led me into, for the first time, the justice system, and ultimately what we call legal expense insurance, which is an add-on that's sold along with home insurance policies that should, in theory, give you access to legal cover if you find yourself in a situation like I did. However, I ultimately discovered through that claim and further claims that I had to make after I was discriminated against by an education facility and a few other parties, that the companies involved in providing the legal expense add-on on behalf of major companies like Barclays, Aviva, LV, were actually committing frauds against policyholders. And this came about by cherry picking claims that they wanted to work on that worked for them financially, and actually committing fraud against people in relation to claims they didn't want to handle. And I built up a large amount of material and basically discovered that I was not the only victim. There were many other people online with similar stories claiming the same thing as me. I devoted myself to this for a decade. I ultimately started to try and get help from the authorities 5 years ago, and found myself being passed from pillar to post with everyone denying that it was their responsibility to help, and actually being blatantly dishonest about their responsibilities and the ethical side of things, as you've mentioned, Andy. So effectively, I went round nearly every justice organisation in the country and ultimately found myself at my MP's door through something called the Parliamentary Commissioner Act, because if a public service authority commits a misconduct against a member of public, he or she is the only person who has the authority to escalate those allegations to the Parliamentary Health Service Ombudsman, who investigates allegations of maladministration against public service authorities. I wrote to my MP for 2.5 years in absolute and utter distress, my life in tatters, having not been able to repair my life after leaving my job with the police in 2009. He ignored nearly every letter I sent, and then he had the police come and arrest me and charge me with stalking. So I'm currently waiting now to find out what's going to happen with this charge. I was charged 6 months ago. I still haven't had any hearing. My hearing has been postponed on 8 occasions. I've had to sit with my 70-year-old father in the courtroom on 4 of those occasions for full days. I've sent letters to both the Crown Office and the police over those 6 months on multiple occasions. All my correspondence has been ignored. So mine's a very extreme story about what can happen when you try to assert your rights and ethics do not exist, either in the financial service industry or in fact at the level of government. So the next stage for me, I've started it, I've made presentations to the United Nations. So I'm here because I was lucky enough to stumble across Andy's stuff online. So I'm very pleased to be here and to hear your stories as well.
Louise, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. It really is it's very upsetting hearing the life experience that some of the TTF members have had. And as I said before, it's horrible when the problem is due to some kind of malpractice, malfeasance, misconduct, or mis-selling by a financial institution such as a bank. But there's almost like another level when you're being let down by the system itself, when it's the system that's supposed to be protecting you and supporting you is letting you down. That takes it to another level, and then there's another level beyond that when the system is actually fighting against you. So at the heart of all of this are the decisions and actions being made by people, and of course at the heart of all that is this incredibly important topic of ethics. Before we go to Cara, let's just invite Tay. Tay, would you like to take yourself off mute and very briefly introduce yourself, please?
I'm Tay, retired and HSGB principal, and a victim. My wife and I are victims of Barclays and his appointed receiver, corporate economic crime, which I have reported to the police, and the police is doing nothing. So I'm in the process making another step forward, which I cannot tell at the moment.
Thank you, Tay. Thank you very much indeed.
All for me. I would like to provide my email to everyone.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you very much. So let me talk about Dr. Kara Tambala, without a doubt, one of my very favourite members of the Transparency Task Force. I'm sharing my screen and I'm showing you the webpage we have about our book. I think all of you know about our book, but just in case you don't, a couple of years ago, we published our book entitled Why We Must Rebuild Trustworthiness and Confidence in Financial Services and How We Can Do It. And the book is essentially a collection of roughly 55 members of the TTF's ideas about how trust and confidence in the financial industry could and should be rebuilt. And the reason I'm showing you this webpage is because Dr. Kara Tambala is the person out of literally thousands and thousands of people within our community that I wanted to reach out to write the foreword for the book. And the more you get to know Kara, the more you'll understand why she was such an obvious choice for this. So let me tell you a bit about Kara. She is the president and founder of the 7 Pillars Institute for Global Finance and Ethics. As it says here, she has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Kansas. She has an MA in philosophy from the University of Kansas too, an MA in liberal studies from New York University, a Master's of Philosophy, Management Studies from Oxford, and a BS, Bachelor of Science in Systems of Management from City University of London. So without a doubt, Dr. Kara Tambala is extremely well qualified in terms of the dynamics and the human dimension to the workings of the financial sector, all built on a long and successful career in Wall Street, which of course brings a whole new dimension to this too. But beyond all of that really clever stuff, and believe me, Dr. Kara Tambala is really clever. Beyond all of that, she just had this wonderful way of communicating and engaging, and we really enjoy that company. I've got vivid memories still of Kara's talk that she gave at one of our in-person events in London a few years ago. She had everyone eating out of the palm of her hand. She's very capable of doing that. So can we please show our appreciation to Kara for writing her book and also for coming to the session tonight to tell us all about it. Thank you, Kara. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Andy. So pleased to be here. I know it's dinner time over there, so if you feel you need to grab something to eat, your cottage pies or your shepherd's pies or whatever, feel free to eat. We're very informal, and I will not be at all offended. But Andy was very nice to invite me to talk about my book today, and the book is entitled Ethics in Finance, Case Studies from a Woman's Life on Wall Street. And the book has won 5 awards, including, I'm proud to say, the UK Business Book Best Business Book Award in the International Business Book category. Now, I wrote the book in 2020, and we all know what 2020 was. It was quarantine year and lockdown year, and we were all going a little stir crazy for sure. I was fortunate enough to be locked down or in quarantine with my entire family, including my sister, who had to stay with me for 6 months because she was unable to return to her home in Singapore. But in any case, the lockdown gave me a very good reason to live in my own mind and to tell myself stories and then to put these stories down on paper. So 2020, thank goodness, was a productive year, if somewhat quiet year. So what I am going to tell you about this book falls into 3 broad sections. Although I don't guarantee that I will not meander around. But first of all, I'd like to tell you about the how of the book, which is the approach of the book and how it is shaped. Secondly, I would like to tell you about the purpose of the book and why I wrote that book. And then third, I'd like to tell you about the how of the book, which is the actual contents of the book. And if we have time, if Andy tells me we have time, I can read you a few excerpts from a particular chapter. Now, the approach of the book, or the how of the books, how is the book shaped? Now, the press release for the book says the book recounts entertaining stories of an immigrant Asian American woman's journey through the top echelons of Wall Street. Well, I love stories, and especially stories in science fiction. And generally, humans love stories. And we have just been telling each other stories of our lives and what we have encountered. We've been telling stories to each other for millennia, since we first walked out of caves. We tell our children stories from the moment they're born. We tell stories to cajole, to entertain, and to teach. In the old days, the stories which had morals attached to them, stories about telling us how we should live, they used to be called parables. And as you know, there are parables in every faith tradition. For instance, there's the celebrated parable of the Good Samaritan, which is what Andy is, for instance, as told in the Christian tradition. But there is also the less well-known story or parable of the mustard seed that is told in the Buddhist tradition. And the story tells of a grieving mother who just lost her young child. She goes to the Buddha and says, Tathagata, which is Pali for the perfect one. She says, Tathagata, can you please bring my child back to life? And the Buddha says, yes, but you must bring me a mustard seed from a household that has not experienced loss or any death. So the mother goes out to countless houses asking for a mustard seed, but each family does admit that it has experienced some loss. So after many days, the grieving mother has not obtained a single mustard seed and realizes that loss is a part of life. She buries her child and she goes to the Buddha and says, Tathagata, please teach me more. Now, from this parable, we get a lesson in the first of the Four Noble Truths, which is the principal tenet of Buddhist teaching. And this first noble truth tells us about the reality of suffering. In modern parlance and with the ascendancy of business, parables have morphed into case studies. So in keeping with business trends, my book comprises case studies, but they are essentially stories. Stories as a means of teaching ethics. The stories I tell in the 10 case studies in the book are not dramatic, huge stories like, oh, my boss was the chairman of Bear Stearns when it went bankrupt, or I nearly stopped Bernie Madoff. No, they are just ordinary stories and everyday stories that financial professionals face. Now, there are writers who write about grand gestures and dramatic events and larger-than-life persons. And I would include in this group Fyodor Dostoevsky. But then there are writers who delight in and linger on small gestures, small human gestures and occasions, and that would include writers like Leo Tolstoy. Now, Dostoevsky writes about murders and revolutions and grand inquisitors. Tolstoy writes about Anna Karenina's tiny red bag and how she bends over into a tiny red bag in which she would put a lace nightcap and some cambric handkerchiefs. And yet the bag is poignant because it is the same red bag that she carries when she jumps in front of a moving train 4.5 years later after we've met her. Now, I promise you, this is the last time I'm going to speak about death. So I write about company Christmas parties, uncomfortable Sunday afternoon telephone conversations, and meetings in windowless conference rooms. Yet these these stories convey meaning, or I hope they do. So in sum, this book uses stories from my own work in finance over 25 years or so to teach about how to spot ethical issues, how to think about why something is wrong, and then decide the right thing to do. So what is the purpose of this book and why did I write it? There are 4 reasons I wrote this book. The first reason is personal. I wrote it for my daughter, Shira, because I wanted her to know what her mom did before she graced our lives with a beautiful presence. I wanted her to know what I did while she was at school, between my making breakfast for her and serving her dinner. But secondly, for professional reasons, I wrote this book to help young people entering the finance industry so that they could try and figure out what to do when they encounter ethical situations and moral problems. And I would say that few, if any, of these young professionals would have had a class or a course in financial ethics in college, because it's a rare finance department that teaches financial ethics. Third, I wanted the public to help the public figure out ethics issues with easily accessible tools. So most people would say, how do I figure out the ethics in this situation? Do I know if it's wrong or right? I just feel that something is wrong. And I give them reasons and tools and frameworks to use to sort out first the issue, second, what to do in such a situation. Now, the second and third reasons help fulfill the mission and the quest of Seven Pillars Institute. I founded Seven Pillars Institute in 2010 after the great financial crisis of 2008. I was so disgusted by what happened in terms of regulatory capture, greed, excessive compensation. And SPI, or Seven Pillars Institute, is the world's only independent think tank for the research, education, and promotion of financial ethics. The statement is also our mission and our elevator pitch. Now, SPI has a mission, but it also has a quest. Mission tends to be corporate and bland, but a quest is cosmic, world-changing. And the quest is, for instance, the quest of the Fellowship in the Lord of the Rings was to find the ring that rules them all and destroy it. If the ring is not destroyed, evil wins over good, and all of Middle-earth is lost. So much rides on the quest. So SPI's quest is to make ethics an integral part of finance theory, because right now, finance theory is devoid of ethics. So where theory goes, practice follows. And the case study that I'm going to read, if I have time, is an encounter I had in a finance department in a business school. And I truly believe that ethics starts from the very beginning at school. If we teach our young people about right and wrong in finance, they will use those tools in practice. And we won't see so many of the problems that you have faced and that we see society facing right now. Now, the contents of this book. In writing this book, I wanted to make the book approachable and comprehensible to everyone. I wanted to reach as wide an audience as I could. And the reader won't need special knowledge about finance or moral philosophy. And you can think about my book as a cross between a memoir and an explainer. An explainer would be like Malcolm Gladwell's book. He wrote a celebrated book called Outliers, The Story of Success. And the most remembered point he makes in the book, because he repeats it constantly, is the 10,000-hour rule. Now, this rule states, the key to achieving world-class expertise in any skill is, to a large extent, a matter of practicing the correct way for a total of 10,000 hours. So you don't have to be born with any particular talent. You just have to practice for 10,000 hours at least. So Outliers was pretty much responsible for every parent or mom or dad pushing their child to practice piano for hours on end. But Gladwell makes psychology and economics accessible, and that's what I want to do with financial ethics. So what is my 10,000 hour rules similarly in the book is don't beat yourself up trying to be ethically perfect rule, by which I mean we are not expected to be perfect in the practice of ethics. We are human and we live in a very messy world, but we are expected to try. We are not allowed to throw up our hands and make lame excuses for not trying to do the right thing. A little on the term ethics, because we're talking so much about it. In my book, ethics and morals are used interchangeably in everyday terms. Ethics derives from the Greek term ethos, which means traditional practice. Morals derive from the Latin mores, denoting custom. Simply put, ethics, as used today, means to do the right thing at the right time for the right reason in the right way. Now, I talked earlier about parables and how the word parables has morphed into the term case studies. Now, when religion was ascendant, the word parables was common usage. Now, when business and economics are ascendant, the term case studies is the norm. So each chapter of my book follows the same structure. First, I have the story in which I relate my experiences. Then I have the ethics issue in which we spot the ethics issue in the story. Then we have the ethics analysis in which we try to understand why something is wrong or ethically or unethical in the story. And then we have right action in which we suggest the right thing to do. So the story, ethics issue, ethics analysis, and right action. And the book moves chronologically. Chapter 1 starts with my first job in finance in Singapore when I was fresh out of graduate school. And the subsequent stories follow my experience as I journey through a finance career via different cities and finance jobs. I was an equity analyst, an equity salesperson, a portfolio manager, a hedge fund manager, an investment consultant, and a lecturer in finance. So let's breeze through a case study. Let's see. Andy, do we have time for a case study for a reading of the case study?
Yes, we do. Yes, we certainly do. Thank you, Cara. Thank you. Please do.
Okay. All right. So let's breeze through a case study in chapter 9. And I realize that it is not a case study on a bank or a financial institution, but I start where ethics needs to start to be promulgated, which is in college. This is where future financiers, financial consultants, and financial regulators will learn the importance of ethics. And yet, very few colleges, especially in the US, teach financial ethics in the finance department. The story is called Gender Inequity in the Finance Academy. My last stop on my finance career highway before I founded Seven Pillars Institute was the land of political minefields, or the academy. Now, Henry Kissinger once said, academic politics are so vicious precisely because the stakes are so small. I taught for a while in the finance department of a business school of a public university, or, the acronym for business school of a public university would be BSPU. I worked as a lecturer teaching financial ethics and a course in financial careers. Now, I taught the financial ethics class to MBAs in a satellite location. My students were all part-time and they were actually working full-time. So in other words, my course did not pose a threat to the faculty. It so happened that a couple of years after I started the course, there was a curriculum reform for undergraduate business classes. Uh-oh. If anyone has some knowledge about the academy, they will know that curriculum reform is one of those minefields I just mentioned. My rather naive and enthusiastic response was to send a proposal for a course in financial ethics taught to finance undergraduates. To my astonishment, not only did the finance faculty reject my proposal, but they also canceled my MBA class. Please note, this was post 2008, when we had just gone through the global financial crisis. I would like to mention the composition of the finance faculty, by the way. There was not a single woman on tenure track in the faculty, 0. The faculty contained about 15 to 20 men who were tenured or on tenure track, and 2 female lecturers, me being one of them, who were not tenured or on tenure track. So I asked for a meeting to discuss and put my case forward to the faculty. And I'll just do a reading from the meeting. In preparing for the meeting, I drew on decades of experience arguing for and marketing my products or ideas to others, many of whom were men. For example, I sold top management at the mutual fund company in which I worked the concept of offering an emerging markets fund. This development was a multi-million-dollar undertaking involving multiple departments. I was put in charge of the endeavor after the president and chief financial officer both agreed to setting my idea into operation. Surely then it was not a leap to think I could do a decent job persuading 15 academics on the worthiness of offering a financial ethics course after the worst financial crisis since the 1929 stock market crash. I was wrong. First, I underestimated the veracity of Kissinger's statement about small matters with low stakes taking on tremendous significance in academic politics. Second, I underestimated the degree of implicit bias male faculty in the Finance Academy harbor against women. The implicit bias was clear in the number of tenured or tenure-track women on the men hired. Did I mention the number was 0? The justification the de facto alpha male, call him B, of the department expounded frequently at faculty meetings for this gender disparity was there were no women in the hiring pool, who met the required criteria. In other words, the men in the hiring committee could find no qualified females to teach their desired type of finance. This sorry excuse for a lack of female representation in organizations is now regarded as lame and inexcusable. B spoke for the group in most meetings and considered himself as someone who, 1, upheld meritocracy, 2, succeeded by his own merit, and 3, in no way was sexist. He was a big man, arrogant, cruelly dismissive, and possessed ostensible certitude in his convictions. B virulently opposed my teaching a course in financial ethics and made that clear at the meeting, which sucked the life from my soul. The room I entered was windowless, lit by 2 long fluorescent light strips, and contained a rectangular, nondescript conference table around which sat 9 men and 1 woman. She who initially recruited me, call her H. The non-tenured male faculty of the department did not think it politically wise to show up for this meeting. No need to jeopardize their tenure by supporting a female lecturer, disliked by the tenured men. The atmosphere was thick with hostility when I entered the room. The men did not smile or greet me warmly, if even at all. H looked down at her notebook. It was evident the men had already made up their minds and resented my impudence to even call a meeting. Anger rose in me against the injustice of this decision. Gamely, I made my presentation anyway, explaining all the reasons mentioned above, and then waited for the inevitable inevitable rejection. We don't agree with you that our finance department needs a course in financial ethics. And the MBAs have a mandatory course in business ethics anyway, squeaked one associate professor, B's minion. While B was tall, the minion was short, with sagging jowls and a pudgy figure. He leaned into the table, channeling up his best Sheryl Sandberg, stared mockingly at me, and attempted an imposing and intimidating stance. He made a surreptitious sidelong glance at B to confirm he had B's approval. The posturing and sycophancy was sad, and I rolled my eyes mentally. We all teach ethics in our courses. We have said many times we incorporate ethics in our lectures whenever it's appropriate. There's no need to take up a precious slot for your proposed course, said B in an overdone stentorian voice. The statement implied he knew moral philosophy well enough to teach ethics. We don't think a course on financial ethics such as yours will benefit the students. Ethics is infused into our classes, interjected an older man, close to retirement, who fancied himself a sagely senior, authoritative presence, proving humans tend to have the best impressions of themselves. But his affected soothing tone was discordant with the hostility in the room. All the while, H remained silent, except for a deep sigh or two throughout the meeting. There would be no support from my fellow female. The men made more patronizing remarks and demonstrated ostentatious indifference to my responses. A couple of younger males made placating and anodyne statements in an attempt to show a little decency. I left the room infuriated and humiliated. The next day, I filed an official complaint to the university office that handled discrimination. So then we go into the next part of the case study, which is an ethics, spotting the ethics issue, which is systemic gender discrimination and implicit bias. Increasing evidence shows gender bias operates at the unconscious level. Even individuals who consciously reject gender norms tend to unconsciously evaluate women and men according to different criteria, and to expect members of each gender to do better in those respects traditionally associated with their gender. This stereotyping is called implicit bias. Looking back at the vitriolic resistance encountered when I proposed a new course in financial ethics, I now see the reaction was predictable. The curriculum is a crucial area where faculty exerts power over type, structure, and content of knowledge provided to students. Academics view the power over course offerings as a vital way to influence educational outcomes, and the power imbues them with a feeling of stature. Thus, the curriculum illustrates the way in which hegemonic definitions of education, culture, and knowledge are contested. Feminists have decoded these secret complicities between power and knowledge, identifying how power functions to determine what students had the opportunity to learn and what was forbidden them. At the BSPU finance department, a male-dominated faculty decided on what the curriculum would be, negating any input from women. In addition to financial ethics, I had suggested the following curriculum additions: microfinance, environmental, social, and governance, or ESG investing, and Islamic finance. The men summarily dismissed all these new course suggestions without any discussion. Now, the third part of the case study is ethics analysis. And in analyzing the ethical issue here, it would be not following fair treatment and not respecting the rights of an individual. So in chapter 5, we discussed at length why gender discrimination is unethical. All ethics frameworks for the analysis of gender discrimination demonstrate the act is wrong and provide reasons why gender discrimination is unethical. Here's a recap of those arguments from chapter 5. Justice theory. Justice is giving each person her due, treating equals equally and unequals unequally. There is no reason to not treat women equally to men. From an ethics point of view, equal opportunity is a moral right of all people. Duty-based ethics. According to Kant's framework of ethics, we must respect human beings as ends in themselves because every human being has dignity and is therefore deserving of respect. Respect for people means fair and equal treatment irrespective of gender. Human rights based on religions. The oldest basis of human rights arises from religion. God confers invaluable rights to humans. These God-given rights, such as the right to freedom and equal treatment, are called natural rights. Women have a natural right to be respected and to equal treatment. Utilitarianism. In evaluating the amount of the good versus bad consequences of excluding women from resources, positions, and decision-making authority, reasonable minds will agree the bad outcomes outweigh the good. Women are harmed, as are men, when they are discriminated against because of their gender. Benefits accrued are few, aside from assuaging some male egos. Now, the fourth part and the last part of each case study in each chapter is right action. So what is the right action in this case? It would be to speak up and garner support. Ensuring the number of women in power positions reaches a critical mass, rather than just the one or two who become tokens in their work area, remains a vital goal. Women should strive to form groups or associations in which they can discuss shared problems of discrimination and harassment. These groups also help women find workable solutions to gender discrimination. Without support and advice from other females and female mentors, women in the academy will likely prefer to not complain because they recognize there are negative repercussions for those who push for change. Women feel it is a balancing act to work for reform without making men feel threatened by change. Sometimes women decide it simply isn't worth the effort. Yet, those of us who can and are willing to make the effort of speaking out should do so. Since the #MeToo movement and the subsequent higher awareness and intolerance of gender discrimination and harassment, organizations are less likely to bury gender discrimination complaints, but we still have a long way to go. Finally, remember Malcolm Gladwell and the memorable point in his book. The point I would like my readers to remember is sort of summed up in this passage. What should you take out of this book? First, don't seek perfection in the practice of ethics. Ethics is not a science with absolute right answers. But just because there are no right answers does not mean that you should not try. We cannot be perfect in every decision involving an ethical issue, but we should not give up trying to think about and then do the right thing. We are called to try our best, but we are not expected to be right all the time. This book aims to be your guide in ethical thinking, so your acts are ethical as far as you are able to be. Thank you.
Cara, thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you. Your work is really enlightening, and you described earlier how it was accessible. It seems easy to understand and easy to follow. So it's very successful in that regard. I have a few questions for you to kind of open up the conversation. Many of our members have suffered as a consequence of malpractice by a financial institution or poor conduct by a regulator. when people are doing bad things, do they necessarily know they're doing bad things, or do they sometimes create a mental framework that justifies their bad conduct and somehow gives them permission to do what they're doing? I'm thinking here, for example, about the conduct leading up to the global financial crisis, where many people were taking, as I understand it, ridiculous short-term risks, but somehow they seem to justify it in their own mind. So talk to us, please, about the tension between how doing the wrong thing can somehow become manipulated into seeming like the right thing. I think human beings have the ability to trick themselves into thinking the wrong is the right.
Yeah, Andy, I think it's called self-justification and rationalization of your actions. But your question about whether we realize we're doing the wrong thing, I think deep down inside, every one of us realizes when we're doing the wrong thing, but we cover it up, as you say, with rationalizations because of some other reason. And mostly in finance, it's greed. And so I have said in my chapter 10 of my book, why it's so important to be profit-oriented. And of course you could say, like, bad acts have been with us since we crawled out of the swamp. It's just part of what we are, perhaps. But my aim is to, even though if I can just change one person, and perhaps in the global financial crisis, perhaps if one person had spoken out, or if a couple of important big people had spoken up and said, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. And there were people who did that and who did avoid it, but we need to multiply the number of people who do that. Then maybe I would have saved a person. I don't expect to change the whole of society because it's systemic, and the system of thought is profit maximization. So everything is fine so long as the market says it's fine, and our goal is profit maximization. And that has been instilled into our thoughts since the 1950s, to the extent that in the US, particularly, this neoliberal profit maximization paradigm has become like truth, that it's okay to do what you do so long as the market accepts it, so long as you maximize profit and shareholders benefit. So if you really want to go to the root of the problem, you have to go and change the economic system that we're living under right now, and we think is right. That's the long-term solution to it, is to change the system and the economic thought, the dominant economic paradigm right now. The short-term solution is what I'm trying to do, which is my mission. The quest is change the paradigm. The mission is teach people how to be ethical right now, right here, and start as far as we can in school. But there will be people who will escape the system and who will continue to act poorly. What can we do? We just want to minimize. We don't want to make it perfect because it's impossible to make it perfect.
Thank you. And one more question from me before we throw this open. We have become very tuned into the challenges created by the revolving door problem, where people move from a regulator to, let's say, a bank, or from a bank to a regulator, or from a political position to becoming the chairman of a bank, all these sorts of things. I know you're very familiar with this issue. On a practical level, can you see anything that can be done to try to manage the almost inevitable consequences of this? Because we end up with people in a position where they're supposed to be serving society or the public in, let's say, a regulatory role, but deep down, either consciously or otherwise, they are thinking about the next big job in the bank or they are somehow serving their mates in the bank they used to work for. Any thoughts about the ethical framework around these sorts of issues?
Yeah, there's definitely a conflict of interest. And I think during the Obama era, they put in a 2-year waiting period before someone from government can work in the private sector and vice versa. I'm not sure if that has already been lifted, but I think something like a waiting period is very good. And it would totally depend on legislation. You would have to do something regulatory from the very top and say, yeah, you can't do this revolving door. You have to have a cooling off period, maybe 1 to 2 years. And I think that's a good idea. And of course, in the US, they have government watchdogs to see if there are any conflicts of interest being done right there and then. But, I think putting in watchdogs also is useful to see if there are any conflicts of interest and people acting on their conflicts of interest.
Cara, thank you very much. Thank you. We'll open it up now and give everybody a chance to share the thoughts that they wish to before we bring the session to a close in perhaps 20 minutes or so. We're not stuck on a fixed time. I can see Nigel's put his hand up, so we'll go to Nigel first. If you'd like to follow Nigel, please put a note in the chat or raise your hand either digitally or wave it at me if you wish. Nigel, let's go to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Cara. You referred earlier on to the students that bought your book. Do you think the students that actually bought your book would have been the students least likely to have benefited from buying the book out of the students on the course, perhaps?
Probably, because they're the ones who's most interested in ethics, and those who are not interested in ethics probably didn't care to buy the book, as you say. But if they had to have a mandatory course in financial ethics where they would have to do coursework and listen to lectures and their grades were dependent on it, then they would be somewhat forced to listen to what it's about. And, perhaps they would absorb something and perhaps they might not, but I think it's worth a try.
Yes, but would they not be the ones that would then be the least receptive?
Yes, but, one should never give up.
No, but there's a reason why I posed the question in this way. And I think the inherent problem that I see is that the banks and other financial institutions, because they pay so well, they can pick the cream of the crop. They can get the people with the best degrees and what have you from universities. But I think historically they've gone further than that, and they've used things, I think they used to be called psychometric testing and things like this, where they deliberately try and filter out people that would have good ethical values, that would believe in fairness. So I think you're already started with a group of people that are already badly skewed against absorbing the values that you're trying to then instill into them. And it's a really deep-seated problem.
I don't know about the psychometric testing. I was told that they do test for ethics, values. So I'm not sure that they try and weed out people without strong values. I can't speak to that. But yeah, of course, it's, people who want to make a lot of money and are willing to do whatever it takes to make a lot of money who enter the profession. But in smaller financial institutions, perhaps, or not the money-centered banks, there are people who do enter the banking industry who really want to serve their clients. And I think there are good people who work in the industry, but we do need to reach those bad apples, I suppose. But the way to mitigate the problem of bad acts is regulation and watchdogs. And I know you have you're skeptical probably about regulators too, because of your experience. So all I can say is, you know, we try to do the best we can to instill ethics in people. We hope that it spreads. We hope that one person like Andy will come out and do something, like you, who will come out and do something. So I don't like to go all negative and say that all hope is lost, because, you know, we're still around.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. Thank you, Cara. Thomas, Dr. Thomas Walford, your hand is up. Go for it.
Thank you very much, Andy. A lot of things have happened over the last 20 years, particularly where ethics have been called into question. And Dr. Cara is quite right to point out that ethical behavior is very important in every industry, not just in the banking industry, but it is probably particularly relevant in the banking industry because it has such a major effect on the clients. And I'd just like to discuss in general, actually, without taking any particular side one way or the other, perhaps probably because I'm an expert witness and therefore need to come at these things impartially, but looking at where ethical behavior sometimes gets confused with robust behavior. And if you consider particularly people who provide mortgages, financial institutions who provide mortgages, is it ever ethical, quote unquote, to actually foreclose on a loan to an individual where actually they may lose their home and their primary residence? And this is a problem that has worried a lot in the financial sector as to actually safeguarding the bank's position and being robust according to the contract that they wrote originally doesn't necessarily mean that they are behaving unethically. And I wondered if you would like to comment on that particular type example where individuals who are clients of financial institutions have quite a serious downside through non-performance of what they potentially have promised the institution when they took out a loan.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, it is a contract, right? And they're acting legally, but I'm not sure if they're acting ethically. But I wouldn't even say ethically. They're acting legally, but depending on each case, I'm not sure if they're acting charitably or generously. And generosity is a virtue, and virtue is part of ethics. So I would say that it's very much a case-by-case basis, whether you should chuck the person out of the house. Perhaps the person is a delinquent payer and is a serial delinquent mortgage defaulter. Perhaps the person, on the other hand, has lost his job and through no fault of his own or her own and cannot find a job, and inflation is horrible, and circumstances have all been terrible to this person. And should you chuck the person out then, or give the person a chance? So I think banks should have a lot of leeway in deciding what to do with that, and in deciding whether to throw a person out of a house. They shouldn't just stick to the letter of the law. Perhaps banks should have an ethics committee who decides what to do in these cases, and they really do research on each mortgage case and decide, yeah, we will foreclose the loan, or no, we will give this person another 6 months. So maybe more thought and consideration in the bank rather than straight the black letter of the law and say, he's delinquent, he's out, that sort of thing.
If I could just come back to you on one point. Of course, in order to be able to foreclose on a loan, they do need to go through the courts. And the courts often will be the ones who would adjudicate as to whether that is a vulnerable person or not. and therefore whether they should be spared the downside that otherwise may result.
That's so the courts have now become the ethics committee then.
Yeah.
I'm asking you, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, courts are supposed to serve justice, right? So the banks cannot even decide on how to act justly. They must throw it over to the judicial side of the government. So yeah, I think it's good. I'm not sure if that's the same system that we have in the US. I haven't studied this, but it would be good if they also went through the courts, because we also have a lot of homeless or houselessness in this country because of foreclosures.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Cara. I think Nigel wanted to come back in on this point. Nigel.
If that's possible, yes. My case actually may be a little bit illustrative along the lines that Dr. Thomas Walford was just raising. I took out a mortgage with a high street bank in 2007. At the height of the financial crisis in 2008, the loan was called in. It was called in because the banks were given carte blanche, it would seem, by the Treasury or the government to recapitalise, and weren't being too fussy about which loans they pulled in. It was a question of shoot first, ask questions later. And this is what they did in my case, quite wrongly. And then from that date until now, I've been contesting the repossession attempts by the bank. I've never missed a single payment. I've never contravened my agreement in any way whatsoever. The primary difficulty for me is that I can't afford the immense amount of money that it would cost to challenge the banks in the courts to argue my case. So it's not necessarily a matter of the protection of the law in these things. It's the undue influence and coercion of the banks in putting people in positions where they can't correctly defend themselves because their pockets aren't deep enough to do so.
And if I may add to what Nigel just said, what Nigel, and then we'll come to Eric, what Nigel just said is a really good example of the kind of David and Goliath battle that we see over and over again, Cara, where a powerful financial institution uses its power very deliberately to force the opponent into submission in some way. And it really has been happening a great deal. It makes me...
Sorry, if I could just interject 1 second there. Sorry, Andy. Because I want to sort of emphasize this point that there can be a common misconception that because the banks take repossession proceedings against people, that these people must have done something wrong somewhere along the line, and the banks wouldn't possibly proceed unless that was the case. Well, I know for sure, but my case is far from being unique. I thought it was for quite a number of years, but I now know through TTF that this is by far away from being the case. But there's no chance really of publicising the inequities because nobody's interested, basically, and the banking and finance industry has such huge power, it just drowns out all the small voices.
It really is a worry.
I don't understand. How can they repossess a house when you've been paying your mortgage? What reason would they have?
The reason they said they could do this, although they now appear to be saying that they conceded that they never had the reason in the first place, was that they said that I borrowed the money because I wanted to run the house. The lending was for business purposes and not for personal purposes. But notwithstanding that, they didn't have the legal right to interrupt or to contravene the contract that we'd entered into. But the bottom line was, it didn't really matter what the legality of the position was, as long as I couldn't afford to contest the matter in the courts. They could put immense pressure on me to sell up and move on, rather than having to go through the courts. I've got no doubt that they would never, ever have actually pushed me through the courts. But that didn't mean that they couldn't anyway put me through immense difficulties to try and get the recapitalize the money and get their money back, which was their original objective. Having made the original move, they weren't in a position to say, sorry, we're wrong. Banks don't do that, and lawyers don't do that. So they've just kept the pressure on and on and on over the years. This is despite having my case heard and eventually found in my favour by the Financial Ombudsman Service. But even despite that, the banks continued afterwards with the same policy.
It's like it really is, you know, a bullying by the banks. There's no legal basis for them to do what they're doing, or moral basis, but they do it anyway. This is the kind of thing, Cara, that we're coming up against all the time. It's really quite tragic. Thank you, Nigel. Eric, you raised your hand, and I think Louise did as well. We'll go to Eric and Louise if she would still like to speak. Thank you, Eric.
Well, the conversation has taken an interesting turn, especially with the word rationalization in one of the responses. And it caused me to think of the training we have in law school. Every one of the scenarios you paint, there are lawyers involved. You know, the decision of a bank to take an action is run by legal department. The regulators are all dealing with legal concepts in the adoption and enforcement of regulations. All of this is done. And the thought that struck me is that in law school, we're taught to argue both sides of the case. You know, that's in the case studies, arguing both sides of the case. So rationalization is actually a principle taught in law school. And I remember early on in my career actually making the statement, of which I'm not particularly proud in reflection, that I can rationalize practically anything, you know, from my training. So you're seeing people that can take a principle and emphasize it. And I'll relate it back to how that caused an evolution in my thinking. I was walking down the hall. This is in the nature of a story, Doctor, and you may appreciate this. I was walking down the hall in my business, and I caught two of my employees arguing about wearing seat belts. One guy was saying it ought to be mandatory that everybody wears a seat belt. Another said it's a matter of personal liberty. You should be able to make your own decision. It's nobody's business whether you're wearing a seat belt or not. And as I'm walking in, they turned to me and asked me which one was right. And as Andy knows, we developed decision assistance technology, and we pick any number of factors and we place weights on them to score and rank the choices that we make. And I said, well, it's simple. You're both right. And they go, well, how can we both be right? I said, well, you're both right because you over here are putting the primary weights on the following factors, which leads naturally to this conclusion being the right conclusion for you, while, you know, the other guy is putting the emphasis on these other factors. This is how it works in reality. This is how everything's working out. This is the mental justification that is given for, so, you know, because when you look at it, Nigel, how can this person look in the mirror and justify as a human being taking this action? This is how it's done. This is how it happens everywhere. And the fact that you mentioned going into the court system, you mentioned going into the ombudsman's office, government is replete with lawyers, all of whom have been trained in virtually the same ways. So
Can I just say that I actually absolutely agree with all your comments. In my case, I'm pretty sure that virtually all the decisions that have been made in the past 15 years have not been made by bank personnel. They've all been made by lawyers. And to a certain extent, it's a gravy train for the lawyers. They're holding the banks to ransom and getting fantastic fees all the way through, and the banks can't get off the hook. They've just got to keep taking the advice from the lawyers, and they're very good at it.
It's one of the reasons why I refer to myself in my meetings as a recovering lawyer, you know, after changing my career emphasis. So that just struck me. I thought I'd share.
That was really interesting, Eric. Thank you very much. That was a great addition. Thank you. We're going to be bringing things to a close shortly, so please raise your hand if you want to come in at this stage. Just wave something at me if you do.
Would
Otherwise,
it be okay for me to say
yeah,
something?
yes, of course, Louise. Please do. Fire away. Thank you.
It's just what you were talking there was very, very relevant to my own situation. And you've mentioned on a few occasions tonight about conflicts of interest.
Yeah.
And to give you a bit of moral support there, Nigel, you said that you weren't able to progress things because you didn't have the money to take a lawyer and take it to court. Well, my situation is truly unbelievable in that I was exactly the same. And this was compounded by my attempts to get a solicitor to help me with claims against the corrupt financial companies that I was fighting against. I actually contacted 360 solicitors in Scotland and England trying to get someone to help me with these claims. And I personally believe that almost all of them were conflicted because they do work for these insurance companies through the very policy that these frauds are taking place on. And I find myself in the ridiculous situation, having been arrested, that I have contacted nearly 500 solicitor firms in Scotland and England. Not one of those solicitor firms are willing to help me defend the charge that's been brought against me by the establishment, effectively by my MP and a police authority. And there's something very wrong here where you can't even get representation involving a claim of financial corruption and corruption within the establishment because of conflicts of interest. And I have also discovered that I lodged 2 claims against my MP and the police myself. I taught myself how to lodge claims prior to being arrested. And I've just discovered that the solicitor who's dealing with the defence of those claims is actually being funded by the main company that I'm alleging has committed fraud against me. So it's like a poison ivy. The conflicts of interest are absolutely everywhere. And it's really scary when you start seeing that web of activity that's going on behind the scenes. So even if you'd managed to get it into court, you know, who knows what would have happened there.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you very much. At some point in time in the next couple of months, we're going to be running an event about state capture. State capture being the systemic and systematic decay of the institutions within the UK. And I'm sure it's not just the UK that has these sorts of issues. I hate saying things like this because it makes me sound like I'm a conspiracy theorist nut job. But what we are actually seeing, if we just look at the evidence, what we are seeing is an ongoing pattern of interconnectedness and interdependency between the banks, the Treasury, the government, the Financial Conduct Authority, the Financial Ombudsman Service, the National Crime Agency, the Serious Fraud Office, the City of London, the City of London Corporation. There's an entire web. And that web seems to have a purpose, and its purpose seems to be to defend itself. And I think it's toxic, and I think it's poisonous, I think it's corrupt, and I think it's decaying society, and it's wreaking havoc on a massive scale. And it's horrible. It really is horrible. And trying to end our session tonight on a positive note. On a positive note, there comes a point in a fight when you think there's a high chance you're going to lose because the other side is just so much bigger than you, so much more powerful than you. And you make the decision to carry on fighting regardless, in the hope and the belief that you standing up to the bully will reduce the chance of that bully picking on some other soul at some future point in time. And this gives me comfort on a personal level, because in so many ways, it would be really easy to conclude that our quest is futile. But it isn't, because we don't know the value of the work we are doing in terms of how it will unravel in the months and the years and in the generations to come. So this is why I think there is great wisdom in what Cara has been saying to us. This is not about being perfect, it's about trying. And that, I know, is what our community is doing. It gives me reassurance that our quest is worthwhile. And a few years ago, somebody taught me the relationship between two very important words: achievement and fulfillment. Achievement and fulfillment. And he put it to me quite simply. He said, achievement is how you look to the outside world, you know, how much money you earn, what kind of house you might have, whether you're a success in your career. And of course, all of those things really do matter. They do matter, they are important. But fulfillment is far more important. Fulfillment is about how you feel inside about yourself and what you're doing. And I think that there is tremendous value in knowing that we're trying to do the right thing. We're speaking truth to power in an organized and systematic way. We're taking on fights that we will probably lose, but knowing that there's value in giving the bully a nosebleed. Even if he beats us up, if we give the bully a nosebleed, it will deter him from doing the same thing with some other soul at some future point in time. And this takes us into a really interesting area. It takes us into the area of, to what extent are you willing to make sacrifices to achieve your goal? You know, and that's a really interesting set of questions. To what extent are you willing to make sacrifices to achieve your goal? And all I know is that the people I've always admired in my life, the people I've known individually, of course, as well as the people that we all look up to, the Martin Luther Kings of this world, the Muhammad Ali's of this world, etc., etc., etc. Whoever those people are that we see as our heroes, they're all people that were willing to make sacrifices. And I think if we think of a kind of Maslow hierarchy of needs when it comes to the world of ethics, I'm mixing up two paradigms here, but if you can think of a Maslow hierarchy of needs when it comes to ethics, somewhere at the very, very top of that pyramid is the willingness to sacrifice, the willingness to sacrifice. And I think within that is real beauty, real beauty on a human level. I'm going to pass back to Cara for her final thoughts, and then we'll bring the session to a close. Cara.
Thank you, Andy. This has been such a great session, and I've loved listening to everybody's stories. And I'm so glad that there is an organization called Transparency Task Force that everyone can come to who share a value for justice and justice in the financial world. And I'm happy that I can contribute in whatever small way, even if it's just a little book about ethics, and it's just my own stories. But you know, if it helps in a little way, I'm glad I could contribute. Thank you, Andy.
Cara, you certainly have. You certainly have. Thank you, Cara, but also thank everybody else for participating and being part of this conversation. Let's give ourselves a collective round of applause. It's been a good evening. Have a good rest of your evening if you're in the UK. Pleasant afternoon to you, Cara. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, folks. Good night. Good
Bye.
afternoon.
Good night.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Louise. Bye, Nigel. Bye, Eric. Bye, everybody. Thank you.